Yeah, I think so much of the don't be judgmental today is just a denial that there's any kind of higher moral standard, right? You know, if that's true, then who are we to judge somebody else? They can do whatever they want, and we have to, withhold any kind of judgment over their behavior. But that's not true, right? God exists, right? And He did create, because He exists, He is that standard Himself. And any violation from that standard is going to have consequences. Hi, friends. This is Scott Allen, president of the Disciple Nations Alliance, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences, the podcast of the Disciple Nations Alliance. As we prepare to launch my newest book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meaning of Our Most Important Words, we wanted to go through each one of these 10 foundational words that are highlighted in the book, discussing their true meaning as well as how they've been fundamentally redefined in our contemporary culture. Now, you might be asking, why do words matter? Well, it's because words and definitions shape the way we think and feel, and that in turn determines our choices and our actions. And that shapes the kind of culture that we live in, for better or for worse. And so, if you want to work for a positive change in culture, in society, it has to begin by restoring the true meaning of our most important words.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Dwight, John, Dad, thank you for joining today. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Great. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you.
Great to have you guys here. For those of you guys who are new, my name is Luke Allen. I will be your host today for this episode of our mini-series as we are preparing for the new book that my dad, Scott Allen, has written and will be released in November. The title of that book is called 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meanings of Our Most Important Words. What are those words? They are as follows: truth, human, sex, marriage, freedom, authority, justice, faith, beauty, and love. These are such important words, and as you guys have heard throughout this series, we are just unpacking these episode by episode, and for today, we are going to be focusing on, I always want to say one of the most important words. They're all important. This one's another important word. But before we jump into that, I just want to let you guys know that for a limited time, we do still have spots open on our launch team. So if you guys would like to get a free copy, a free early release copy of this book, you can do that today by signing up for the launch team. And the way that works is we will send you guys, if you sign up, a free copy of the book so that you can read it, review it, and then at the publication of the book in November, you can hop on Amazon and just leave us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads. We'd really appreciate that. So it's a quid pro quo. We give you a book, you leave us a review, and that's how the launch team works. To sign up for that, just head over to 10wordsbook.org. Again, that is 10wordsbook.org. And you can spell that either with the number 10 or TEN. And sign up today. Unfortunately, for our global audience, we only can give this offer to people living in the U.S. or Canada, and that is going to be one copy of the book per address. So those are the rules of the game. But again, the address is 10wordsbook.org. And by the way, on that website, that really is a landing page for all things 10 Words Book to Heal Our Broken World. So if you guys head over there, you can find out a lot more information about the book, see some endorsements about it, see the introduction, so on and so forth. To get into today's discussion, like I said, this is an important word. In fact, this is such an important word that, Dad, when you started writing this book back in, I don't know, what was it, 2018, maybe even before that, you
Probably
got
1999.
To this, right?
Was it that long ago?
It's been a long journey.
It has been a long time.
It's been a journey,
Yeah,
a good one.
No.
It
No ribbing
has.
me, Dwight.
I mean, yeah, it goes back quite a ways. But the reason it's taken so long is because you were working on the book chapter by chapter, and you got to this word that we're going to be talking about today, and you realize this word has been so radically redefined right now that you had to take the manuscript, put it up on the shelf, write an entire book about this word, which was the book that you wrote back in 2020. I'm guessing a lot of our listeners will be familiar with that book. It's called why social justice is not biblical justice, an urgent appeal to fellow Christians in a time of social crisis. So yes, today's word is justice. For those of you guys who have read that book, then today's discussion will hopefully be a great refresher for you. And if you have not read that book yet, then you can go ahead and grab a copy after this discussion. I've linked that book down in the show notes. So Dad, to get us started today, why is social justice not biblical justice? How do you define justice in this chapter of your new book, both the true and the false definitions?
Yeah. So when we turn to the Bible, this is how I think you see justice in a very concise way. And this is how I put it in the book. It's conformity to God's moral standard as revealed in the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament and the royal law in the New Testament. The royal law is love your neighbor as yourself. So that's it in a nutshell. Justice involves living in right relationships with God and with other people, and giving them their due, treating them as we ought, in other words, as image bearers of God. So that's basically what justice is. And then it also involves upholding justice. And so justice, we understand justice as impartially rendering judgments and righting wrongs and punishing wrongdoing or law-breaking. That aspect of justice is reserved for God himself or God-ordained authorities. That includes people like parents in a home or elders in a church, teachers in a school, or civil authorities in the state. So that's in a nutshell, biblical justice. And then I've contrasted that with how justice is understood today in the culture, particularly by those who advocate for social justice, that phrase social justice. And the way that they've redefined justice is along these lines. Justice is deconstructing traditional systems and structures that are deemed to be oppressive, and then redistributing power and resources from oppressors to their victims in the pursuit of what they call equity, or we might call equality of outcome. So, same word, different dictionaries, very different ideas.
Yeah, well, I'm listening to that, Scott, and I know you could unpack that in an entire book, which you've done. But I'm going to jump in with just an observation right away, because you said two things that really jumped out at me, that frame justice so much broader than the social justice definition that you also shared, and that's this justice is giving people their due as image bearers. And then justice is alignment. You did more than this, but justice is alignment to a moral standard for goodness or righteousness. And I'm thinking of that first one, giving people their due as image bearers. Could you just unpack that a bit? What does that mean? Yeah.
True justice means that we treat people as they really are, as image bearers of God with incredible dignity and with worth. And so this idea of people as image bearers of God with all of their value and their God-given rights to life and to liberty, this idea is completely absent when justice is redefined apart from God. So you don't see people in this way. So this is really, really basic to true justice or biblical justice, is treating people as they truly are, giving them their due, treating them with the respect that they deserve as image bearers of God. And this is why the Bible places such a high emphasis on treating all people, kind of even the most marginalized, the most broken, the most impoverished, with dignity and respect. So this is this biblical idea of justice as doing good to people who are broken, marginalized, and oppressed because they bear God's image.
And it also requires, if that's the moral standard, image bearers of God, then it means understanding what that means, because if I'm going to hold somebody accountable to that, it's, well, what does it mean to be an image bearer of God? So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's really the most basic thing that you have to understand about justice. And I got this, Dwight, it's this idea of alignment to a standard of what is good or right. And when you go to Webster's dictionary, this was kind of eye-opening to me when I did my research. He defines, he comes up with this Latin word, justus, I think is how it's pronounced, which means straight, actually, straight. I thought that's kind of interesting, straight, this concept of straight, and it brought to my mind like a
plumb line.
A plumb line, exactly. So if you want a straight wall, you have to have a standard, against which you measure straight. That's the plumb line. So then the question is, for justice, you need a standard for what is not straight but good or right, and that standard is God himself. So it's his own character. And interestingly enough, God's character is holy, it's righteous, it's just, and even he himself can't violate it. So there's a limit. He even places a limit on himself. So in the Bible we read, for example, that God can't tell a lie. That would be to violate his own nature because he's completely and utterly truthful. So justice in the Bible, the most basic thing you can say about it is that it's alignment to a standard, an eternal, unchangeable standard for good and right that's true across all cultures and all times, and it's rooted in God himself. So,
and Scott, I would just add that the beauty of the Bible and and God's standard is that behavior and that justice is really a state of the heart, and it's only possible being led by the Holy Spirit. It's a state of the heart and an intention standard sometimes, not just a standard of action. In the Sermon on the Mount, in the state of our heart, above and beyond our actions, is just an incredible standard that we're called to as believers, and possible only by the Spirit. So it's a higher standard, a more beautiful, powerful, and comprehensive standard than anything that mankind can do on our own. But we of course take that standard in the rule of law and such, and apply it to our own lives.
Yeah, that's right, John. And so, God, of course, he communicates his standard to us. Otherwise, we'd have no idea of what this standard of righteousness or right is. And so he communicates it to us, by writing it down, actually. God communicates through words and language in the Scriptures. And you see this, specifically in the Old Testament in his writing the Ten Commandments, the law, which then becomes this standard for what is right and wrong for not just the Jewish people, but all people at all times. And he also communicates it, interestingly enough, to us inwardly in our hearts, so we have a conscience. C.S. Lewis observed, in his famous book, Mere Christianity, I think it's the first chapter, he titled that chapter, Right and Wrong is a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And what he was getting at there is that, no matter what culture you go to, whatever time period, there's this kind of strange standard that people have for right and wrong that's largely similar. Not entirely, but largely similar, and so he's asking the question, where did people get that from? How did they have, and the Apostle Paul in Romans says, well, God gave it, he imprinted it. This is his language, he imprinted it on the heart. So the law is both written down and delivered by God through the Ten Commandments, but also he's put it on our hearts. And it's like you say, John, it's a very high standard. It's his own standard, and consequently in a fallen world, we all fall short of it. So, this is another important idea of biblical justice, is that all of us are unjust. We all violate that standard. We've all broken the Ten Commandments at some level, So...
Yeah, there's a couple of these presuppositions that you have to kind of get right in order to understand justice. One of them, like you just said, is human depravity.
Yep.
And then the other one that we were just talking about is that there needs to be an ultimate authority, that the plumb line,
yes,
which is God, which is justice, and that we're made in his image. Kind of those three things.
And so, just how important that is too, Luke. I just want to underscore that, because if God doesn't, if the standard doesn't originate with him, then it's going to originate with somebody, some human being, or really some powerful group or person. So those are the only two options. You can either have a moral standard that God himself defines for all of us, or we've got to live with some standard that some powerful group or human being is going to impose on the rest of us. So.
And I mean, that's the truth with so many of these words in this book, the 10 Words book, is if we're not listening to God's definitions, the biblical definitions, then someone gets to do it. And do we really trust our human brothers to make those kind of decisions for us? I'd rather not.
Right.
And the other thing is that you underscored that if we go with God's definition, it also rings true with our own conscience, our own heart. So there's a sense of trueness to it.
Yeah, so that brings me to my question, Dad. I mean, this book is written for Christians by a Christian. However, how would you define justice for someone using more of kind of a natural law approach to it, without using God in the definition or the Bible? Natural law theory. We were talking about this with Katie Faust recently on an episode, Dwight and I. And how natural law theory, if it's done well and objectively, it will align with the biblical worldview, because the natural law is pointing to the natural world, which is God's world. So he wrote the instruction manual for it, so it's going to align with him. But in a roundabout way, you can explain natural law without, with kind of de-religifying it, as Katie said, to make it more widely heard by everybody. So how would you go about that definition? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think, you appeal to people's sense, as Dwight was saying, their sense of what is right and wrong, and particularly when it comes to things like basic human rights and human dignity. In other words, you can be a non-Christian and have a strong sense that, people ought not to be just sold into sex slavery, if you have the power to do that, let's say, or taken into slavery of any kind or murdered. In other words, people have a deep sense, whether you're Christian or not, that human beings deserve some basic human rights. And you hear that language of human rights all the time. The problem for non-Christians is it's just untethered. It's just floating out there in space. It's not actually rooted to God. And it ultimately doesn't work if it's untethered from God, But still, everyone's got a deep sense of that, and people actually love that idea of human rights. The United Nations put that right in its charter. Dwight, what's that called? The Charter of Human Rights or Human Dignity. And they didn't appeal to God, but there it is, in that United Nations charter. So. So I think, too, another way is just we all don't like it when we're victimized by injustice, right? So if somebody steals something from us, right, we know that that's wrong, and we rightly take offense. We cry out for justice, right? So Christian or not, we all have this inward sense of right and wrong that's kind of imprinted on our hearts and that we function, based on. So I'm not sure if that's getting to your question too much, but...
Yeah, I would say that the do unto others principle applies here, and most people would answer that the same way when they say do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yeah,
that's very, very much a kind of a common revelation that we have with one another on how we want to be treated justly.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, if you Google that particular golden rule, you'll find out that just about all of the religions and philosophies of the world have some version of that.
Hi, friends. I want to tell you real quick about how you can get your hands on an early release copy of this book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World. If you're interested, we would like to invite you to sign up for our book launch team. What is the book launch team, you ask? Well, it's an agreement between us and you that, number one, we will send you a free early released copy of this book in October. And then number two, in response, you will read the book and leave us an Amazon review upon its publication date. And if you really want to be a super fan, you can even share the book with a friend. To sign up for the book launch team, head to 10wordsbook.org. Again, that is 10wordsbook.org. Spell that either with the number or TEN. And by the way, as an insider tip, don't wait too long to sign up because there is only 100 spots available on this book launch team.
Yeah, and I think natural law, to me, the way I understand natural law is it's a law, if you will, that aligns with God's created order, right? The way that He made things and kind of who He is. So whether you believe in God or not, we all live in the world that He made. It functions according to certain laws, whether they be, physical laws like the law of gravity, or moral laws, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We all live in that world, and we have to function according to those laws, whether we believe in God or not. I'm a big natural law theorist, but that's my understanding of it.
I think appeal to first grade mentality. It's like I think of little first graders. That you don't have to teach them that if you take somebody else's eraser, it's stealing. It's like, hey, you took my eraser. Or if somebody's talking and somebody talks over them, well, then you shouldn't talk over that person, or you don't let them play on your team on the resource field. There's just this natural thing that happens in first graders, but you got to teach them what pronoun to use. You got to teach them if one child is more privileged than another. That's not natural law. That's kind of it's a construct. So.
Right. Yeah, I'm reading a book right now that's kind of interesting. It's the third journey of Captain Cook. He's the famous British explorer who mapped a good bit of our world in the late 1700s. And the chapters that I'm reading right now, he's showing up in places like Hawaii, and he's meeting indigenous people for the first time. And it's just a fascinating kind of cultural or anthropological, reading, because they all, they're different for sure, and they've never met each other, completely different cultural backgrounds, but they still know, and you steal something, it's wrong, and that happens, So anyways, it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, Dad, and if just to dig into part 2 of your definition here, the true definition that you write in the book, it digs into the impartial rendering of judgment, righting wrongs, and meting out punishment for lawbreakers, a task reserved for God and God-ordained authorities, including parents in the home, elders in the church, teachers in the school, and civic authorities in the state. So this question of righting wrongs and rendering out judgment is a true part of justice. We see that all throughout the Old Testament, especially in the Pentateuch. How did you go about explaining that in the book?
I just think, for most people, when we think about justice, it brings to mind things like the criminal justice system and punishment of wrongdoing and courts and trials and prison and all of this kinds of thing. And so it's important to say, how does that factor in? And I think, of course, justice involves, doing what is right, treating people as we ought, but it also involves, and we can be grateful for this, the punishment of wrongdoing, of injustice, or of evil. And that's something that we see in the Scriptures clearly, that upholding justice means not just allowing injustice to go unchecked, but to call it out, to judge it, and to punish it. There's a level of, in God's character, a level of just hatred of injustice, of wrath, because injustice, evil, it harms people that He loves. And so He's not content, just like any good father is not content just to be, allow their children to be treated unjustly, to be raped or murdered or whatever. Justice involves a judgment against that and a punishment. So in the Bible, that judgment and that punishment is done by God-ordained authorities. And so where the first part of justice, the doing what is right, treating other people as their due, this is kind of a duty of everybody. All human beings have this responsibility. This second part is not for everybody. It's for God and God-ordained authority. So God Himself, the Bible makes it very clear, He's the one who's going to punish injustice. And He's going to do it perfectly, We see this especially at the very end in the book of Revelation with the throne of judgment. And the Bible constantly refers to this throne of judgment where we will actually have to stand, all of us, and there'll be a book that's open that'll represent all of the thoughts and actions that we've done in our lives. Nothing's going to be hidden at that point, and it's all going to be judged against God's law, against his perfect standard of righteousness. So he himself will judge and punish all wrongdoing. This is an amazing thought, that not any violation, no matter how small or large, of his law, of his standard, will be unpunished, will be unjudged. It will all be judged and punished. Now, so God himself is the standard, is the one who does this judgment and punishment. But then he delegates it. We talked about this in authority. God delegates this authority kind of amazingly to human beings too. Again, not all human beings, but certain God-ordained authorities. This would be parents in the home. So parents have got a responsibility for upholding justice in the home. That is, punishing wrongdoing. And so disciplining their children. Same in a church. And civil authorities have this responsibility and right in the state. Paul says that they bear the sword, civil authorities. In other words, they rightly can put you in prison and hold you guilty in a court of law and punish you. So not everyone can do that, but civil authorities have that right to do that. So that's just, I think, really, it's also basic, but it's important to kind of lay that down as well. And it's really important that this is done, because where this upholding of true justice and punishment of injustice isn't done, things quickly spiral out of control. And frankly, we're seeing that in a lot of our cities here in the United States right now, where as we move away from biblical justice into social justice or false justice, you're seeing civil authorities, frankly, no longer punishing injustice, and cities are becoming very chaotic. There's rampant kind of theft and violence is on the rise. So,
Scott, you also make a point in your video just about the idea of rendering justice as a government official or as a policeman or whatever, that it's a matter of there's a debt incurred against the victim.
Yes.
And that has to be righted in this world. It's not just punishment,
right.
but speak to that.
Yeah, the image of justice, that picture of Lady Justice, is really a good one. We can think about her, that image. It's very biblical. And she's got scales, right? And the scales are balanced. In other words, true justice requires scales to be balanced, such that if I commit a crime against you, Dwight, if I steal something from you, that's the picture of the scales being out of balance. I've taken something from you, and so now I owe you. So in order for justice to be rendered, I have to pay back. Then the scale is balanced again. And that could be property, it could be life, it could be reputation. Whatever I've taken or stolen, it creates an imbalance on that scale, and justice requires that scale to be balanced. So that's very much a biblical idea. How that judgment is rendered is also really important in the Bible. In other words, it can't just be done at a whim. It has to be done very carefully. It has to be based on the truth. So, in other words, you have to truly stolen something from me or done something wrong to me, not just my accusation of that, but it has to actually truly have happened. So the Bible says that accusations of wrongdoing have to be backed up by witnesses. That's very clear in the Old Testament. And not just any one witness, too. It's got to be 2 or 3 witnesses that, render truthful testimony. So truth is very important to justice. And also impartiality. So the judge has to be impartial and can't be bribed, because God himself, as our ultimate judge, is impartial. He doesn't treat us based on he doesn't treat us with favoritism depending on our skin color or group or whatever. He treats us impartially, and we're all judged impartially before the law. That's the blind justice idea. The Lady Justice is wearing the blindfold, and then the sword that she carries is the punishment. So all of those are really important aspects. And it's based on God himself and how he executes judgment. He does it impartially. He does it without taking bribes. You can't bribe him. So, but again, when all of these biblical ideas are gone, all of these ideas are threatened, right? So justice becomes, it's not based on impartiality. Certain powerful groups become favored, right? And you get, this kind of lawfare that we're seeing in our own country right now, sadly.
So it's about clear and communicated standards that people know, and they know when they're violating the law or not, whether or not they want to get away with it or not. And it's, as you said, it's also about consistency,
right,
in applying the law. And a very simple example are speed limits. So it's clear, it's communicated, it's posted.
Yep.
And whether there's consistency in applying it or no depends on your luck of where you are when the police comes or not. And so it's not perfectly applied in consistency. But that, again, is just a demonstration of there is no perfect impartiality except from God. And Romans 13, of course, covers all of this very well in the establishment of authorities. And it says in verse 3, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. And so we should do what is good, and we will receive approval, for the authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain."
Yeah. I think that Romans verse, it's a really important one for justice, but it does presuppose the understanding that those civil authorities are upholding, the laws that they're upholding are in alignment with God's law. Now, there is obviously times in human history when civil authorities don't believe in God, they dismiss God's higher law, they create man-made laws that are completely out of alignment with God's law. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, you saw this, where civil authorities created laws, for example, around how Jews were treated. And if you tried to rescue Jews that were being taken to the concentration camp, you were violating Nazi laws. So that Romans verse that you just quoted, John, doesn't really apply in that case because the civil authorities there are not working for the good, right, as defined by God. Right. They're actually doing just the opposite. So in that case, you actually have a moral responsibility to disobey. There is a place in the Bible for civil disobedience if those human authorities are kind of openly violating and flaunting God's law. So I think it should be done obviously very carefully. It shouldn't be our inclination our inclination should be to obey, human authorities, civil authorities. But only up to a point, right? If they are clearly, violating God's law, we are not under obligation to obey those laws. In fact, it's just the opposite. So.
Right. Again, all of this demonstrates that only God is truly impartial, and only He can do that. So only He can truly judge that proper behavior.
Yep. And that's a really important point, actually, John, is that true justice, it's never going to be done perfectly in a fallen world. It's not that we don't try. As parents, we have to try our best to discipline our kids. But even I found that to be one of the hardest parts of being a parent, was to uphold justice in the home, because you don't really know exactly what happened, And sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, and it's just very hard to do. And it's hard in a family, it's hard in a society. But we have to try, and we're actually held accountable. If we're an authority, we're held accountable by God for how we do that. But we can rest in the fact that God Himself is a perfect judge, and He's going to do it perfectly at the end. And I think that's really an important point to make, because, again, when justice is redefined apart from God, then there isn't this, we can wait for final judgment, and we have to do it ourselves, right? We have to kind of create this perfect utopian society, which we never can do. We end up doing really horrible things. And I think this is why in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, God said, when the servants said, "Hey, should we go out and uproot these weeds? These weeds that were planted by the evil one, this injustice in the world. Should we root out the injustice?" Is kind of what they're saying. And God says, be very careful. I'll take care of that when I come back. Because if you do it as fallen people, you're likely to pull out the wheat. Which is true. We have a hard time exercising this justice, but nevertheless, we have to do it to the degree we're able.
I don't remember the book, but Miroslav Volf is a theologian, went to Fuller, and he wrote something on the genocide in Kosovo. And he said at the end of the day, mercy and forgiveness can only be executed or be implemented because there is justice, eternal justice.
Yeah.
Because how do you possibly forgive somebody who's killed your entire family?
Yeah.
And yet he said, but you've already said this, Scott, but it's that assurance that there will be a real judgment that's real true and real honest and real fair.
Yeah,
and
we need
so we
that,
can
actually
move forward, and we don't have to execute justice today and wipe out everybody who's harmed us.
But the other side of that too, Dwight, is the Bible makes very clear is that we're all, when we stand before that final judgment and that book is opened and our life is put on display there, then we're going to be found to be lawbreakers, and we're going to have to face the punishment for that, which is death. So, but this is really gets us to the heart of the gospel, right? The incredible good news that the Scripture provides, which is that there's a way of escape because God Himself, because of His love. So justice is core to God's character, but so is love and mercy, right? And because both of those are central to His character, He, this is why we have the incarnation, God Himself taking on human flesh and coming down to earth and ultimately paying the price for the law-breaking, the injustice that we've committed. If we confess, right? That's the thing. "Oh Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." Otherwise I'm going to pay that penalty myself. But if we confess, God says, "You're forgiven. The penalty that you deserve is going to be paid for by my Son on the cross," which is there's nothing like that in any other belief system in human history. It's just incredibly remarkable where you get both justice completely upheld right alongside mercy and forgiveness. And that's so important for cultures and society. You need actually both of those things. If you don't have justice, you just have evil run amok. But if you don't have mercy and forgiveness, I always think of the famous Broadway play or book, Les Miserables, where the villain, is this, Javert, this guy who's committed to justice but without a shred of mercy, right? It destroys things when you have that. So the Bible, thankfully, gives us both justice and mercy.
Mm-hmm. When you explained that, you were kind of just walking through the Romans road, right? That evangelism tool where you start out with no one is righteous, not even one. The wages of sin are death.
Mm-hmm.
But then the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Savior.
Mm-hmm.
I forget the other one, but sometimes when Christians read these verses, we think, okay, no one is righteous, not even one. If that's true, which it is, then who am I to judge someone else upon their behavior, upon their sin? Who am I to look at someone else who might not believe in God like I do and yet uphold them to God's moral standard?
Mm-hmm.
And we hear this all the time. Aren't Christians not supposed to judge anyone?
Mm-hmm.
And then Christians think about it and like, well, should I? Because I'm not any better than they are. We're just all image bearers, and I sin too. And I've got the speck in my own eye, or the log in my own eye, and shouldn't take speck out of someone else's. How do you respond to that here, Dad? For people that have been given that responsibility to enforce judgment, impartially render judgment upon other people?
Yeah, I think the Bible says two things, Luke, in response. One is that, we should be very careful about rendering judgment against other people because we ourselves are under God's judgment and we ourselves are lawbreakers, and we've got as you said, logs in our own eye. And so the Bible makes that very clear. Like, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. You aren't, perfect at all. And so be careful about judging others. It says that. It also says that if you are in a position of authority, God-ordained authority, you do have a responsibility to uphold justice and to make judgments, not based on your own righteousness, but based on God's, right? And that's for the good of a society. So it says both of those things, and they're not. I don't think they are contradictory to each other. We should be humble, right? Even if we have a position of authority and authority to render judgment and punish, we should be very humble about that, right? Recognizing that we ourselves are under a higher authority, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, the key is, or I don't know about the key, but one thing that helps me when reconciling this is not to put the attention on myself, as in I am better than you, I am judging you.
Right.
That's pride. That's putting myself up, pushing them down.
Yeah.
But instead looking at them and asking, what is the highest good for you that I can help you towards? And if you're going away from that, then, I might judge you. I might try to redirect you towards the best for you.
Yeah.
And that'll look like judgment, but in actuality, I'm just loving my neighbor as myself, trying to uphold the...
Yeah, I think so much of the don't be judgmental today is just a denial that there's any kind of higher moral standard, right? And so just, if that's true, then who are we to judge somebody else? They can do whatever they want, and we have to, withhold any kind of judgment over their behavior. But that's not true, right? There is a God exists, right? And he did create us, because he exists, he is that standard himself. And any violation from that standard is going to have consequences in a real powerful way.
Yeah, and we'd better hope so. I mean, that kind of brings us to our next point. And what kind of culture does this biblical understanding of justice create? Like you just said, if there isn't a higher moral standard, then we're all our own moral standards, and we all go about trying to make our own justice, and the world's absolute chaos because we all have our own understanding of that, and we all want to feel justified in ourselves. Bunch of selfish people running around judging each other.
Yeah,
that doesn't work. So this other definition definitely just right off of the face value seems to work better, but let's dig into that a little bit. What kind of culture does this biblical view of justice create?
Yeah, well, I think there was I wish I had this in front of me now, but there was a kind of a social experiment that was done. I think it was in Toronto. There was this time when there was a strike and the police all went on strike, and for some period of time, maybe a week or two, there literally wasn't any law enforcement in the city. So then, what happened? And even in Canada, this button-down kind of society, things just went absolutely berserk. They went chaotic. So this is the world. This is the fallen world apart from justice, right? Any kind of justice. Things just break down dramatically. So the converse of that is where biblical justice is understood and upheld. You have order, you can have harmony, and you need that, right? People need a degree of order in order to function, right? A level of trust and order in order to just live my life and do my work and kind of rise to that full potential that God has. You just can't do that in a society where there's just violence and corruption and disorder and all sorts of brokenness. So yeah, biblical justice is the thing that makes that possible, and it does it in a really beautiful way. It does it in a humble way. It treats even people that are lawbreakers with respect, with as we could say, due process, because they're image bearers of God, right? So it's careful to render judgment. It understands that we're all under God's ultimate judgment. There's a degree of mercy and justice that go together. So these are all kind of fruits, I think, of a society shaped by biblical justice.
Yeah. John, you look like you had something to say.
Yeah, when where people do this, we demonstrate law-abiding behaviors. We have courage if there's something that needs to be done, and the marginalized or poor or somebody being hurt by this, we We have courage if something needs to be done, but we also expect and can trust that those authorities that are established by God are going to do things to ensure that the consequences of misbehavior are handled. So all of these things together we can observe a city or a society that is going to be healthier than the opposite. You use your Toronto example or Canada example, and so that's what we observe, and that's what we expect in those kinds of societies. And again, it starts with the people, because the justices and the police and fire and others that are there can't be everywhere. So it really depends on a just people who understand what is good and right and uphold that. Not perfectly, but generally uphold that. That's a good-looking society.
Yeah, I think of my parents' hometown. It was a little town in northwestern Oklahoma that was a law and order town. And you could go out at night and not worry about anything. You could leave money on the counter and not worry that somebody would take it. You could leave your car running on a cold day on the street and it would be just fine. So you get a really flourishing, beautiful society when there's justice and it's people live by it and people implement it. So.
Yeah. I think another fruit of biblical justice is, you see a lot less corruption and bribery in societies that are deeply shaped by the Bible, because God himself says in the scriptures that he is impartial and he takes no bribes. And so, as Darrow, our friend, often says, we build societies or cultures in the image of the God that we worship. So if the true God that we worship takes no bribes, that's going to reflect itself in the culture that we create. And there's going to be less corruption, less bribery. When we don't worship the living God, we tend to be driven by our selfish desires, and then you get all sorts of corruption, bribery, and that really destroys. It just destroys societies, as we know.
I liked what you were saying, John, about the importance of encouraging this throughout a society and a culture, and I think for a lot of sometimes we have those discussions in the church of should Christians try to influence culture, or is that too secular for us and we need to stay in our sacred lane as Christians? And I think this is a perfect example of that. Is don't you want to follow the Great Commission, go and disciple the nations, to create cultures and societies where justice is implemented? It's the best for everyone. Don't we want that? Isn't that part of our commission as Christians? And where you see Christians do that, it's beautiful, and obviously that's us working through God's power, being His hands and feet. But still, it can really transform a nation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Good Christians should be good citizens, and I think another measure of a thriving society is that it attracts investment. And I'm not only talking about investment of economic kind, but it really does. And so
absolutely,
there's no fear to invest, because you see the fruit, and this kind of infrastructure is really attractive to investment and job creation and all. And
yeah, you're not going to invest if you think it's all going to get stolen or robbed and taken from you. Exactly.
Right. Right.
Well, we are on the clock, so I think it's time to move into halftime and prepare for the second half of the game here. Dad, would you mind just reading the two definitions for us again before we move into the conversation around the false definition here?
Let's see. Let me get back to that really quick here.
No problem.
So, the true definition, I'll just read the beginning of it. It's conformity, or alignment is another word, conformity to God's moral standard as revealed in the Ten Commandments and the royal law. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's living in right relationship with God and with others, giving them their due as image bearers of God. Now, today, that's been redefined, and in our culture, people understand justice in a different way. It's the tearing down of traditional structures and systems that are deemed to be oppressive, and the redistribution of power and resources from oppressors to victims in the pursuit of equity or equality of outcome.
Yeah, so let's dig into that second definition there. Right away, Dad, you were mentioning before Lady Justice, and she has a blindfold on. And I think the blindfolds, we already talked about this, but justice should be blind, impartial. This second definition, that's the first thing that jumped out to me here. It is not impartial at all.
No.
And there's this push to restructure society in order to make it more just, which requires partiality.
Yeah.
So let's dig into that.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say about this redefined notion of justice is that there's no mention of God, right? So God's absent, and so you think, well, how can we have justice apart from God? Well, you're still going to have some, basis for right and wrong, and we see that here in this redefined justice. But the basis for that, the standard for that, isn't God Himself. It's the people who are in power, essentially. They're determining what is right and wrong. So you have a very inverted morality with this redefined justice. So, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned it in this discussion or not, but the person that probably is most responsible for kind of the ideas behind this redefined justice is Karl Marx. And he actually borrowed, the Christian notion of right and wrong from the Bible, right? If you don't have a God, you really don't have any basis for right and wrong. But he borrowed this understanding of right and wrong, or morality, and then he kind of secularized it. And he defined it this way. He said, you can divide the entire world into two groups, oppressors and victims. And in this world, oppressors are evil, right? That's the source of evil and injustice. Whereas victims, those who've been victimized by the oppressors, are good, right? They're sinless, if you will. So this is kind of this inverted morality, if you will, of Karl Marx. And then he goes on and he defines oppression. It's not rooted in human hearts, because unlike the Bible, there isn't any kind of doctrine of human depravity or sin. So he says all of this injustice is rooted in outside of man, in society and in social systems and structures. So, for example, Marx had said the structure that's creating the injustice here is capitalism, this economic system. On what basis is it unjust? Because it results in inequality between economic inequality between capitalists, owners of property, and workers. And it's interesting. For him, justice was not alignment to a standard of goodness based in God. Justice was equality of outcome. Okay, this is a really different idea. It's a lack of any kind of disparity between groups. Everyone's the same. C.S. Lewis kind of defined this notion this way. He said, "Let no man live who is wiser or better or more famous or more handsome than the mass. Cut them all down to a level, all slaves, all ciphers, all nobodies, all equals." So this kind of Marxist idea of justice is to cut everyone down until they are the same, equal, right? Nobody's got more money, nobody's got less. They even look the same. So where you saw, for example, in the Maoist revolutions in China, people will even dress the same, right? They had to all be the same, all equals. Ciphers is the word he used. So this idea of equality, by the way, equality is an idea that you see in the scriptures for sure. For example, we see equality in the fact that God created all human beings with equal dignity. We all equally bear God's image, right? And you also see it in the fact that when God judges us in Revelation, we're going to be judged equally before the law, right? So equality is a biblical idea, but this idea of equality or equity of everyone being the same isn't a biblical idea at all, actually. So, to make everyone the same, you have to do all this powerful social engineering, and you have to take away people's freedom, right?
Yeah.
And that just runs completely counter to the Bible and completely counter to the way God created us as human beings. Thoughts on that? Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, just a quick thought. I think that's right. That's a good way to explain that. But you made it sound very, very bad, and yet at the same time, this definition is the predominant definition, I would say, of most cultures around us. And if it's such a bad definition, then why do so many people believe it? If Karl Marx was so evil, then why do so many people follow him? And I think, like most lies that are very, sell well, it's based on truth, a little bit of truth. And then there's a lie mixed in. And you got to give Marx a little bit of credit with his first hypothesis, or his first theory, is that there is real injustices. He lived during the height of the Industrial Revolution. We saw child labor. We saw people working, every 24/7. There was extremely wealthy people monopolizing everyone else and stepping on them. And there was some real inequality. And he saw that, and he tried to come up with a solution to that. And we still see that today. There's people that are desperately poor around us, and sometimes it's because other people are oppressing them. That's definitely real. Yeah. So then we look for a solution to that, and Marx's somewhat answers our hypothesis as well. Yeah. So there's definitely something deep in our hearts that this kind of calls to. And you have to recognize that, and yet his solution is definitely wrong. No, making everyone the same is very evil, as you were just saying.
You're right, Luke. No, and it's really a good point. I mean, there is a real thing called oppression. The Bible speaks about it, and there are victims of oppression in a fallen world. And so you're correct that Marx was looking at a real thing. He did his theorizing in London. In the, I believe it was in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, and he thought that London was ripe for a communist revolution because there was such dramatic inequality between factory owners and people that they were exploiting, the child laborers. And if you've read any of Charles Dickens's books, he often talks about England during this time and the same conditions that gave rise to the French Revolution. So it's real. I think where it goes wrong is that, he assumes that, he sees a real thing and then he kind of makes it an ultimate thing. In other words, that's all that exists, such that if you are a wealthy capitalist property owner, let's say, the only reason for that is because you've stolen. Right? You've taken from somebody. You've oppressed them. Okay, that may have happened, but it may not have. You might have worked very hard, right? And you might actually be generous, and you might even share what you've earned, with other people, right? Marx doesn't give any credence to that, right? You got it because you stole it, right? So at the root of it is this kind of idea of envy, of I've been exploited, I'm not being treated fairly. It's interesting that I listened to Jordan Peterson talk about this, and he traces this all the way back to Cain and Abel, right? He said that kind of the root of the Marxist idea, you can find the seeds of it in the heart of Cain, right? They both brought, Cain and Abel both brought their offerings to God, but God was pleased with Abel's and not with Cain's, and Cain became embittered, right, about that, and angry, and he felt like I'm not being treated fairly, and it's those are kind of those ideas that give rise to this system of belief. I thought that was interesting. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, back quickly too about the falsity of equality of outcome. We don't have equality of outcome even within a family.
No.
Siblings within a family take different paths. Some work harder, some study harder, and we have different outcomes even within a family where virtually everything is equal in terms of their upbringing and standards and all of that. So to expect that we could have that in a society is just not possible, even if we wanted it. And then to move to talk about wanting betterment for everyone. We do. I mean, that's a great Christian principle of compassion, and we should do that, and we should love our neighbor as ourselves and want that for other people through compassion, but not being compelled.
Right.
And so that's the idea of Marxism, is that we're compelled through things being taken away and given to others and things, and there's no agency on the part of the lower, and there's no incentive and no motivation to work hard and to earn and to grow on the part of those who do have something and maybe have the kinds of skills and talents that can help create for the betterment of all. And so it may ultimately result in an equality of outcome, but in a low, miserable state. And no
it
one
has
wants
to be,
that.
yeah, you're right, John. It has to be forced or imposed through these kind of powerful social engineering, because it goes against our basic human nature, which means that, God created us free, right? And our free choices result in different outcomes. I mean, that's just how God made us. And, you even see this, for example, I always think of the parable of the talents. The owner of the whatever it is, the proper, the land, the king, goes away to a distant country, and he leaves his followers with some talents. They don't all get the same amount, by the way. One gets one gets two, one gets three. They're different. And then when he comes back, he holds them accountable for what they did, the choices that they made, for how they invested those talents, and he expected a return on his investment. And so, interestingly, the one that had one buried it, right? The one that had 2 and 3, they invested it and got a return. God, said, "Well done. That's what I wanted," and took from the one, took it and gave it to the one that had 3, right? So it just completely goes against this idea of equity or equality, equality of outcome, because God holds us accountable, right, for the choices that we make and the talents that he gives us, and he wants us to invest those and make wise choices. So the only way you can have this perfect equality of outcome is by tearing everyone down, essentially. So,
it breeds tribalism, which is
there's all sorts of things that are wrong with this notion of justice. I think one of the greatest things that's wrong with it is that it says that evil doesn't exist in the human heart. It exists with a particular group of people, right? They're the source of evil. They're what's wrong with the world. And whenever you think that way, it's completely dangerous and deadly. So the Nazis thought this way. The problem with the world are the Jews, right? The problem with the world are the Hutus, or the problem with the world today, you hear in social justice circles, are whites or whiteness, or people that uphold Christian morality. So whenever evil is sourced not in the human heart equally, I guess, but with a particular group, and this group is innocent, that group is guilty, you just tear society apart. You're asking for, it's a short step to genocide, when you think that way. Anyways, we talked originally about Karl Marx's kind of vision of social justice being economic and based on class and income, and capitalism was the evil system. We have to recognize that today it's been updated, if you will. This kind of Marxist theory has been reconfigured for our present day, and the dividing line isn't so much class and economics as it is there's other divides that are much more prevalent today. And so I just mentioned one, race. So the divide between whites and people of color is exploited in today's social justice Marxist kind of idea. The divide between men and women, and the divide between, let's say, people that uphold traditional Christian views on sexuality, male-female, marriage, etc., and people who don't, who want to just practice sex in any way that they wish, or their sexual identity. So you see the same basic ideas of Marx, but kind of reconfigured. And there's a whole story on how that happened and why that happened. In short, it was because the old ideas weren't effective in places like England and the United States. They didn't lead to the kind of communist or socialist revolutions that Marx envisioned. So a new generation of Marxist theorists said we've got to come up with some changes to the basic ideas that will be effective in societies like the United States. And so they were right. They were highly effective, and really did lead to an institutionalization of this kind of false Marxist view of justice in our society.
Yeah, and if you're curious to learn more about that cultural Marxism and the modern day name that goes under, which is social justice, then I would recommend checking out Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice. Again, that's linked in the show notes. Before we get wrapped up today, let's quickly talk about how do we as Christians recover the true definition that we're talking about at the beginning of this podcast, the one that actually leads to flourishing and is in order with the world that God created for us to live in. Dwight, I'm tagging you for this one.
I think we go back to the beginning of the discussion, and we know the definition of justice, that it's giving people their due as image bearers. We understand what that means to be an image bearer and what it means to give a person their due as that. And it means to align our lives and help others align to a moral standard that's for goodness and righteousness, that's begins with God and His Word, 10 Commandments, our natural consciences, and we begin there and we practice that, and that's a good starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree, Dwight. You recognize a counterfeit by looking at the original. So we have to really know the true thing clearly. I wrote that book, by the way, because a lot of Christians, I was surprised just how much they'd absorbed at some level this kind of Marxist social justice idea of justice. And I thought they just hadn't studied the original well enough to recognize the counterfeit, so they allowed these kind of Marxist ideas at some level to shape their thinking. And no surprise, because this is what's taught in public schools. This is what this is DEI training in our institutions. I mean, we're kind of bombarded really by these ideas of justice. So unless there's a real intentionality, this is what you're going to, we are shaped more deeply by the culture than we realize. This is what you're going to come away with. So I think that is the challenge we face right now. Is we've lived now for several years under kind of heavy propaganda and teaching and indoctrination on this false justice, such that even Christians haven't sorted it out.
Yeah, and Dwight said it earlier. We live as Christ commands us to live, the greatest commandment, and the second commandment, to love our neighbors ourselves. I've mentioned this before, not necessarily on podcasts, but with you all. One of my favorite books was The Tragedy of American Compassion by Marvin Olasky back in the early 90s. And it's really about demonstrating that compassion and that love for our neighbors and ourselves. And he has a quote in there, which I can't say verbatim, but it basically says that it's not about us giving things and giving money, but it's about how we give of ourselves, give of our time, give of our talents, give of our love to one another, that really makes this kind of thing. So we want great outcomes for society. We want great outcomes for all kinds of people. We serve the poor, we serve the marginalized, but we do it from from Scripture and the basis of Scripture and the basis of Christ's love, not compelled to do it, and not doing it by the wrong way. So it's a beautiful expression of living for Christ if we do it properly.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good place to wrap up. This is another one of these words that you're going to hear tossed around all over the place, inside the church, outside the church. We hear justice everywhere, but just as Christians, we got to be careful about how people are defining that, especially people that have influence over us, authors that we're reading, pastors, and just line up their definition with the true one and see if it's a counterfeit. Hopefully it's not, but just be very careful with this word going forward and make sure that you're protecting or promoting the true definition. Again, I just want to remind you guys that there is a few spots left on the launch team, so you can go and sign up today at 10wordsbook.org and get your free copy of the book, early released copy. I also wanted to let you guys know about our upcoming Bible study video course that is going to be accompanying the book, coming out at the same time in November. Dad, would you mind telling everyone about that real quick? I know you're working on that right now.
Yeah. So for each of the 10 words, we've created, with the help of our good friend Jeff Krieger, some really wonderful videos that kind of get to the essence of both the true definition and the counterfeit for each of these 10 words in a very creative way, very interesting to watch. And so we're creating around those videos a 10-week course so that you can go study the scriptures yourself more deeply and then come together with other Christians and watch the video and discuss and pray and just learn together and deepen your own understanding. Really excited about this course. It's going to be, Lord willing, coming out simultaneously with the book. So we'll have both this podcast series that we're working on now, the book itself, and then the course as well, the video course.
Yeah, exactly. And the video course will be coming out on the same day that the book is published, hopefully, which is November 19th. So you can mark that in your calendar if you would like to hop on Amazon that day and give us a review if you're on the launch team. If not, obviously you want to read the book before you give us a review and let us know your thoughts after that. But November 19th is the big date, again, for all things Ideas Have Consequences is this podcast, but for all things 10 Words Book, go to 10wordsbook.org. And on that page, you can sign up for the launch team. You can also sign up for the course once that comes out, and you can order the book once that comes out as well. So yeah, all things will be on that page. You can also, of course, get updates about the book on our social media here at the Disciple Nations Alliance. We are the Disciple Nations Alliance on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And for any other information about our ministry here at the DNA, you can go to disciplenations.org. Anyways, that's enough for today, guys. Thanks again for listening. We always appreciate your time and attention, and thanks again for listening to this episode of Ideas Have Consequences.